How's it going, guys? Welcome to the show. Well, it has been a little while since I put out a video, but I am going to pick up where I left off last time, and that is installing a 944/924S oil pan gasket. Now, 944 and 924S oil pan gaskets have a reputation for leaking and also being a pain in the ass to replace. So in this video, I'm going to show you a few tricks as how to get this installed, do it right, and make sure that it doesn't leak afterwards. All right, time to pull off this pan. There we go. Take it apart, get it cleaned up, and ready for the new gasket. Boy, there's still quite a bit of oil in there. The early 944s don't have them, but like the late 944s, my 924S has an oil level sending unit. And it is kind of a nice feature because if you get to about a quart low of oil, 8mm, the light will flash on your dash and you'll know that you need to add a quart of oil. The gasket for the sender didn't come in the gasket kit, but I ordered one separately from Pelican. And how are you supposed to get this out? Right. So I took out the sender and then removed the plastic baffle. There's part of the pan with that baffle in that you can't reach to clean. That's why I ended up taking it out. If you don't want to mess with it, just leave it in there and clean the pan as best you can. But if you do, be careful because they get brittle and crack very easily. Boy, that sucker's in there good. Speaking of cracks, I decided to pull out this plug. That plug is actually there because the same 2.5 engine comes in the turbo 944s, and the turbos have an oil return, and instead of a plug there, they have the return pipe going into the oil pan. Well, my gasket kit came with an O-ring for that plug, so I figured, all right, I might as well pull it out and put a new O-ring on it. Probably should have put some breaker loose or something on here. I would recommend you don't mess with that plug. As long as it's not leaking, leave it in there because I got a nice surprise when I got mine off. A little tiny bit of sludge in there, but for the most part, the pan is, yeah, there's some crud in there. I can feel it. It's a little gritty. So I mean, it's a little dirty, but really not bad. So I started cleaning up the pan and checked out what looked like cracks, but actually aren't. It looks like a big old crack going right across these fins. But there's no cracks coming through to the inside of the pan. There's other casting flaws, you know, and you can see where somebody, I guess that's from a grinding tool at the factory. I don't know what the heck they were doing here. Kind of funny, but it's not cracked, it's just flaws in the casting. Scrape all this off. At some point, some previous owner must have tried to seal the oil pan with some aircraft gasket sealer, so I had to scrape that off of the pan and then off of the rails too. And after that, I just did a good job and cleaned up the oil pan and all the surfaces on the engine block as well. And here is a look at the new gasket. This is the part number that was on the gasket kit if you're interested. And now I had to figure out what the heck I was going to do with this dang thread that peeled up. I took my Dremel with a diamond burr on the end of it and cut right where it seemed like that thread stopped lifting up. Oh, you could see it was cracked almost right underneath where I cut it. It's interesting. So it turned out to be a pretty good point where I ground on there. After removing that, it threaded in nice. Alright, so I've got some high temperature Teflon. I just bought it. So I'm gonna try this. I slathered a nice even coat of that stuff on the threads of the plug and tried to get it real nice and even inside the threads of the hole. And hoped that between the sealant and the O-ring there was enough material there to prevent it from leaking, and it actually worked out pretty well. And I even got in there and removed that little bit of extra Teflon sealant there, just so it wasn't mixing with my oil. Putting your hardware in a piece of cardboard keeps it in order and works well for cleaning it. The small bolts for the oil level sender were full of some gasket adhesive stuff that was just really stuck in there, so I dug that out by hand, get ready to put that in later. I was a little bit bothered by that little rubber / plastic piece that holds the float from going off the top of the oil level sender because it was kind of loose. I assume it shrank over time and it just became kind of loose. And I went online to see if there was some way I could replace that, but unfortunately there aren't any parts listed for this except for the whole unit, which is like $400. Finally, I was like, well, it hasn't caused any problems. It's still on there, so I'm just gonna reuse it. So there's the pan all nice and clean, and the degreaser that I used kind of etched it, sorta. And at this point, I could have painted it or, painted my motor, but I decided to just leave it aluminum. It's been my experience that when you paint aluminum, it looks good at first, but over time, if you keep the car and you drive it a lot, which I do with mine, eventually it starts to peel and flake off, and it just kind of starts to look like crap. Because I drive this car all the time, and Porsche just left it cast aluminum from the factory, I decided to leave it. There is my new gasket, and the thing that makes these so difficult to install is the new gaskets are shrunken. They need to be stretched, and also there's nothing that holds them in place to the pan. Yeah, it definitely needs to be stretched a little bit to fit. And you also have to put silicone or RTV in the corners of the gasket. You're supposed to put it on either side of the gasket, on the pan side and on the block side, or at least that's the way I did it. So it's kind of tricky. Oh, in my eye, I can feel it. There's some crud down inside these bolt holes. I really don't want to take out these screws and mess with that. I'm just gonna do exactly what I'm doing. I'm gonna wipe it off the best I can. There's a portion of that baffle that's like a plastic cover that's screwed on to the rest of the baffle with screws, but I didn't want to take it apart and risk cracking or breaking the plastic. So I cleaned the rest of the baffle the best I could without getting it wet or full of any solvent. Made sure it was clean around there, kind of down inside there. Cleaned this thing up. Now I couldn't find any torque specs for these screws, which kind of drives me nuts, but I'm gonna put high temp Loctite on them and I guess do them to feel. So I installed the baffle with the high temp Loctite on the threads of those little screws, and you definitely need a long Allen wrench in order to get in there and tighten these correctly. And then the oil level sending unit, I just made sure I knew how that slipped in and out of the pan, and I'm actually going to install that later. Now that I had the pan ready to go, I turned my attention to the engine block and made sure that everything was completely clean underneath there. I cleaned all the crud that had fallen from scraping off those rails and landed on the girdle, just to make sure there was no dirt or grime inside the pan. And then I ran into something that you definitely want to avoid. I thought all the surfaces were clean and was ready to put the pan up with the new gasket, but it turned out there was some fresh oil that had dripped down from either inside those bolt holes or behind the back of the engine block. And if I didn't go back and check, I would have installed this pan with that little bit of oil there, and it would have probably caused leaks, or at least caused the RTV to not seal correctly in that corner. So when you do this, check the back of your pan, check those back corners to see if a little bit of oil didn't drip down there after you're done cleaning it, because that's what I had. And I ended up going back and cleaning out those furthest back bolt holes and the recess for the gasket really well. I threaded the bolts in the bolt holes to force any oil out of there that might have been in there. I got in there with some Q-tips. I used brake parts cleaner and let it sit for a while to make sure that it stayed completely dry and was ready for the new gasket. Alright, well obviously you need to make sure your pan is completely clean and dry. I cleaned mine again with solvent just to make sure, and then I wiped off the corners of the gasket where you need to put the RTV. I cleaned the gasket itself off. It has a little bit of talcum powder and a little bit of oil or whatever maybe, but I cleaned it off in those corners to make sure it was completely free of any residue, and then tied the gasket to the pan with some dental floss. Now the dental floss works good because it's basically super thin, and after you get the pan up, then you can just snip the dental floss and pull the dental floss out, and you don't have any gap or anything up there. I tied the gasket onto the pan loosely with some dental floss first, but then after I put the RTV on, I went back and I tied it as tight as I could in the center and on both ends to try to hold the gasket as best I could in its place, with the gasket situated a little bit more towards the back, because as I'm lifting the pan up, I want to get the back in first and then stretch the gasket towards the front and get it seated in the front last. So there you can see I'm doing the corners there now on the back of the pan, and then kind of pulling it towards the back and setting it down loosely against that RTV. Then I went back and redid the dental floss. I tied the gasket as tightly as I could to the pan. You can see there, it's about as tight as I could get it. And the gasket is situated a little bit more towards the rear. You're going to smear the RTV a little bit. There's no way of avoiding it. Try to avoid moving it around as best you can. And then I tied it in the rear corners, in the middle, and then up in the front too. You just want to keep that gasket lined up so that as you lift it up, it's basically in the right spot, and you're still going to need to move it around a little bit, but you want to get it as closely to the spot where it needs to be as you can. So I'm going to take some of this and squirt it just up in the corner right there. And then do the same thing, you know, here in the corner here too. There you can see I'm applying the RTV up in the front. You need to do it in all four corners. You don't need a ton, just enough to seal the corners after it's all put back together and torqued. There's a shot of one of the corners where I put the RTV. All right, it's finally time to put this in. Now it's a little tricky because you have to work around the baffle and the oil pickup and everything. But once you get it past that, then gently try to get the pan up. Make sure your seal is situated in the back correctly so that you can get inside the lip underneath the rear main seal. And then once you get it up all the way to the point where the gasket is in the recess underneath the rear main seal that will hold it in its place, then you can stretch it a little bit as you work towards the front of the pan and stretch it into place so that then the front of the gasket gets pushed up into the recess where it needs to go, and the whole pan will be situated up to the point where you can start putting in the bolts. Kind of got it where it needed to go, and then I ended up putting the back in first and then stretching the gasket itself by putting a punch through the holes of the oil pan, kind of stretching it to where it needed to go. I put a punch like through, say if I was going to put this bolt in, I put a punch through this hole, stretched the gasket until I saw the aluminum spacer center in the hole where I was going to put the bolt through, and then put the bolt through, and then kind of worked my way towards the front. You have to hold the pan up there tight while you're doing this though, to make sure the back doesn't pop out. Actually, it would be nice to have a friend. If you have somebody help you do this, it would probably be a lot easier. And then I started by putting one bolt in the side just to hold the pan up. Then went to the front and tried to situate that gasket so that it was stretched forward as much as I could without pulling it out of the back and underneath the bolt holes and in the recess where it needs to fit into the front. Then finally, after I felt like that was good, then I went to the back of the pan, put 2 bolts in the rear of the pan so that I knew it was good enough to hold that rear up and in place. Before you completely tighten it down, make sure you remove your dental floss. Also, you've got the dental floss going through the bolt holes, so you need to remove it from the bolts that you're going to be putting in there. And then worked my way towards the front from the back of the pan, stretching the gasket with a punch or a screwdriver and putting the bolts in the sides, and worked my way up towards the front. And then after that, it's just really kind of a lot of fiddling around, going back and forth, making sure the gasket is where it needs to be, and then stretching that gasket into place and working it towards the front, putting the bolts in where I thought they needed to go in order to hold the gasket straight and in its spot. Then after a while, finally got all the bolts in and tried to push the pan up as tight as I could while tightening the bolts and getting them all snug. And then once I finally got them all in there, it looked like the gasket was situated right. I was sure that it was underneath the lips in the front and the back where it needed to be. Then I took a wrench and a few other tools, because there's parts of the pan where you can't use a socket, you need to use a wrench. And I used that flexible ratchet driver there, which came in handy just for the shape of the pan and because it's bendable. And then once I got it, snugging up there, I tried to work from the center out, because I figured that's probably the way you're supposed to tighten this thing down. All right, get the torque wrench and figure out if there's a pattern. All right, I've got this page open from Clark's Garage. They give you the torque sequence. So I'm going to follow that, and then it says you're supposed to do them in a couple of steps, first 3 pounds and then 6 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to follow this sequence and then go around and torque them all 2, 3, and then 6 pounds. Then you just follow the instructions, follow the order that you're supposed to do each bolt, and follow the torque specs, do it in 2 steps, and then you're done. All right, well, there it is. You can see the RTV squishing out there in the corners. There it is up there. I wasn't able to torque these bolts here with my torque wrench. I couldn't get anything in there to get them, so I just did them by hand with the wrench and kind of guessed at it. But besides that, I still got to put my oil level sender in there, and obviously the plug isn't in there, but the oil pan is on the car. I went back and forth trying to decide if I wanted to use some Loctite, and I decided not to. When I took the pan off, the bolts weren't loose, so I mean, I read a lot of stuff about guys having problems and using Loctite or using lock washers and all this stuff, but I'm thinking that might be guys who are racing. A lot of those guys have balanced shaft deletes, so they probably have more vibrations and stuff. So I can always go back and put Loctite in there if I need to, but I decided the factory doesn't use it, so I'll just do it without it, plus it's easier. So there it is. Thanks for watching the show, guys. Be sure to check back for new episodes of Project Porsche. See you next time.